Hi, tonight I'm going to focus on Mark chapter 7, as opposed to trying to get through two chapters like we usually do. So I will be doing this video tonight and Mark 8 next week. So let me just get the sharing up. Oops. Let me get the sharing up and we'll get started. In the last session, we observed how Jesus' encounter with the demon possessed man was an example of that spiritual principle that whenever we take a step forward for God, we seem to immediately be confronted by opposition. Now, our initial passage tonight in Mark 7 it doesn't provide a clear link between what went before and what comes next. But the appearance of the Pharisees here, as well as the scribes from Jerusalem, represents the first that we've heard from them since Mark chapter 3, verse 6, when they determined that they were going to destroy Jesus. Now, we did hear from the scribes later in chapter 3, verse 22, when they accused Jesus of casting out demons by means of Satan. And as a result, Frederick Grant believed that it was the scribes who instigated the trouble that we have in our passage tonight. But I'm thinking that the reference to some scribes or certain scribes from Jerusalem in the text may actually suggest that the scribes were a smaller contingent than the contingent of the Pharisees here. But even so, it's essentially strange bedfellows getting together to oppose Jesus. And even without an overt link to the previous chapter, it seems clear that we're to be informed of significant opposition to Jesus and why. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes from Jerusalem congregated in his presence, and seeing some of his disciples eating bread with profane hands, this is not ritually washed. So to me, it's interesting that the verb that I translated as congregated and is often translated as gathered is the verbal form from which the word synagogue originated. I find it interesting because the wording is interesting that Pharisees and scribes, often Sadducees, gathered to him or in front of him. It could also be translated as before him, which I take as in his presence. But the unusual phrasing seems to suggest that both the Pharisees and the scribes were aimed at Jesus. And this, along with the identifier from Jerusalem, suggests that they were part of an investigative committee on their way to see what this Jesus person was all about. But probably in the light of the Pharisees' stated opposition in Mark chapter 3, we could probably refer to them as a hanging jury. That is, one that wants to hang the defendant, not a hung jury that can't agree. Now, some see that phrase as being from Jerusalem, as suggesting that this scene takes place in Galilee, while others see it taking place near Jerusalem and causing a break with Jerusalem. I actually don't see evidence for either in uh, Galilee or near Jerusalem in that phrase from Jerusalem. It could have implied a long journey to stir up trouble or a short journey to accomplish the same thing. Now, I do rather like the idea of the Galilean setting because of a 1905 suggestion by H.B. Sweet, where he suggested that what these religious fanatics from Jerusalem observed was that the disciples were traveling through the countryside, eating some of the bread that they had obtained from the 12 baskets that were left over from the miraculous feeding in Mark 6. And in such a situation, it would have been very tempting for them to just try to wash their hands by rubbing their hands together with friction. But of course, that wouldn't be a real ceremonial washing, and it wouldn't please the Jews. So regardless, the issue from the perspective of this gathering of strange bedfellows, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, wasn't as much hygiene as it was ritual, tradition, and rules. You also notice I use profane hands, where some translations say unclean, and some go all the way to say contaminated. But that's because the word is kinos, or koinos, if you use the Erasmian pronunciation. It's the word for common. And it's the word for the type of Greek that's used in writing the New Testament. It's common. Why did I translate it as profane? Because it's like they're looking down their nose at people. Oh, that's common. It's not spiritual. Oh, that's common. It's not good. But then again, in English, the same thing is true. The word profane, which today seems to indicate something vulgar or something dirty, originally just meant something ordinary, something mundane, something common. In fact, New Testament Greek is called common, koine or kine Greek, as opposed to classical or Attic Greek. And it uses that same word. Among Jews, it eventually came to be used as the opposite of holy. If you're not holy, you're common. And actually, even in modern English, that idea of being profane means something unholy today. So the word common actually becomes rather a theme in Mark chapter 7. It appears here in verse 2, in verse 5, when the question is quoted, in Jesus' statement in verse 15 about nothing outside being able to make one profane or common, when Jesus restated the principle in verse 18 in the idea that it's what comes out of a person that makes them profane, and he reinstates it again in verse 23. And by the way, since my constituency is an Asian congregation, I might note that eating bread, as it's written here, is a typical Jewish phrase for eating in general. In Asians, a lot of times, if you want to ask if a person is fed, you say, have they eaten rice? Now, this isn't theologically significant, but I thought you'd find it interesting before we get into what's the real issue for these religious leaders. And actually, even though my aside about eating rice, eating bread, may not be relevant to the entire chapter, it gives me a chance to introduce the single sentence that Mark gives us as a parenthesis in verses 3 and 4 as a slight introduction. because verses 1 and 2 that we have here gives us the setup. But Mark interrupts the narrative and gives a parenthesis in verses 3 and 4 that gives us a long explanation of why the Jews thought this issue was so important. And although Mark has inside information on the Jewish experience, we know that his work with both Peter and Paul would have given him a sensitivity to what non-Jews needed to understand about this controversy. So the interruption also serves to emphasize that the coming question in verse 5 doesn't merely apply to this particular incident, but it applies to legalism as a principle that governs the whole of the Jewish synagogue tradition at that time. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat if the hands are not washed with the fist, holding fast to the tradition of the elders, even coming from the agora. If they haven't immersed, they don't eat. And there are many other things which they perceived as tradition to hold on to, immersing cups, pots, and copper bowls, and with some manuscripts, adding even couches. Now, it's helpful to know that there are multiple legalistic ideas here, but there are some words and phrases that might seem strange to you. For example, how does one wash with the fist? Now, it might be the idea of holding your fists up like this as someone pours water over the fist so that the water ends up dripping down to the wrist and even, like the Muslims sometimes, all the way down to the elbow. And this would compare with those Muslim practices because the water in ceremonial ablutions is supposed to make you clean, even if it's just a drip that's going all the way down to the elbow. And it could, this idea of washing with the fist, mean that you do it diligently, as when you're washing one hand with the other one coming over it, sort of like a closed fist. And that would be a reasonable possibility. It could be that one hand was balled in the hollow of another's hand. But regardless, what the strange word tells you is that this was more about proper form than about cleanliness. And that verb that I translated as holding fast to the tradition of the elders, it could just as easily be translated as seizing or arresting, because it implies that you're making an effort to hold on to something or to restrain something. So Mark is explaining, possibly to a Roman audience, that the Jews make a great effort to maintain their ancestral patriarchal tradition. And this word for tradition denotes what's been passed along from one to another, and among the Jews, especially that body of rabbinical interpretation that was transmitted for a while as the oral transmission from one generation to another. And this transmitted transition is only found elsewhere in the Gospels in a parallel passage in Matthew, but it actually fits the parallel verb in verse 4 about what the Jews have received. So bear with me as I share one expositor's summary of these points before we get even deeper in the details. He writes, quote, "The authority of tradition was growing, and this sentence piles up impressively the details of a heavy ceremonial burden. It pictures how a great faith can degenerate into mere motions without religious or ethical significance. The inevitable result is that the motions, the scourings, the cleanings actually become a substitute for the faith. End quote. Now, in verse 4, I added the coming in brackets as a verb, even though that verb isn't in the text. But I did it because the word that's used for washing is the root for baptism, to dip or to immerse. And it made more sense to me that the devout Jew would take a bath after going to the marketplace and being contaminated by the crowd and by all the strange goods and foods there, and presumably even being touched by the unwashed poor. But it could be, and this is why I keep the idea in brackets, that anything that they bring from the marketplace, from the agora, has to be washed before it's consumed. Now, this was usually done by sprinkling, and so the alternate reading in some manuscripts is being sprinkled as opposed to being washed. But even though some commentators note this, they think that it's a minor emendation and that the idea of immersion is the proper idea of washing here. Well, I believe the ceremony, whether it was with whole bodies or with the items that were purchased in the agora, needed to be washed, dipped down in the water to have the full ceremonial impact. But the minutiae is clearly illustrated here when we see that different vessels and different objects are singled out for washing. In addition to the cups from which one drinks, are the pots which serve to measure out the pint portions. Those pots are pronounced zestas or zestos with a soft X sound, and they come from the Latin sextarius, which means a copper pot, most likely a cauldron or a kettle. And in a very few manuscripts, it adds the word couches, which sometimes in English versions are translated as beds, which is kind of confusing unless you remember that when you were dining in both the Greco-Roman tradition and in the Palestinian Jew tradition, you reclined to eat. So you had these couches that you pulled up to the table as opposed to chairs in order to eat. But this long list of cups, pots, copper bowls, and sometimes couches just reminds us of how restrictive the tradition was, just like many kosher regulations today. I remember hearing about a friend's grandfather whose kosher wife disapproved of what he ate outside the home. So she accused him of having two stomachs, one for the clean food that she provided at home, and one for the unclean food that he ingested outside the home. He really disliked the kosher restrictions, so he acted out when he got away from home. Now, after Mark shows his Gentile readers and us just how tangled these regulations have become, well, then he resumes the scene with the conjunction and in verse 5 to show us that the parenthetical phrase, the explanation, is over. And as a result, The Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with profane hands?" But he said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy concerning you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with lips, but their heart is kept far away from me. They worship me for no purpose, teaching the rules of men as doctrine, abandoning the commands of God. You hold fast to the tradition of humans." Now, we can definitely sympathize with those people who want religion to have standards, but while we can approve of standards, this manner of life quickly degenerates into fussiness over detail and an overly picky attitude about externals and minor matters, as the previous list in verses 3 and 4 make clear. But Jesus just absolutely cuts through this camouflage to the heart of true religion, which is the religion of the heart. Cutting through that camouflage, Jesus does what he often does. He quotes scripture to do it. So he quotes from Isaiah 29:13. However, here is a point at which scholars can overanalyze a text. Because there are many scholars who think that because the text doesn't quite line up with either the Hebrew reading that you have down at the bottom of the screen, their fear of me is a commandment of men which hath been taught them, which Jesus doesn't use, or even the Septuagint wording at the top, this people draws near to me with its mouth, and with their lips they honor me, but their heart is far from me, but in vain they honor me, teaching commandments and teachings of men. So teaching commandments and teachings of men, slightly different from the way Jesus did it, was abandoning the commandments of God. They hold fast to the tradition of humans, which would be the teachings of humans. So they think because it isn't a direct quote from either the Septuagint or the Hebrew Bible that Jesus would be familiar with, that Mark put these words in Jesus's mouth. These scholars and those they were citing argue that Jesus would have known the exact quotation from the Septuagint or from the Hebrew Bible. But you have to remember that in the first century, scrolls were still expensive and rare. So a lot of times, scriptural quotations were memorized and written in short collections that make certain points. And in those cases, when you were trying to make a certain point, one didn't necessarily always get the full quotation or the context. And in this case, it's very probable that Jesus quoted from one of those collections of Old Testament prophecies and chose this wording because it's absolutely going to set up the way that he's going to turn the condemnation of the prophecy into a direct accusation toward these Pharisees and scribes. So you'll notice that even though Jesus is still speaking in verse 8, it doesn't match up with either the Septuagint or the Hebrew text of Isaiah. That's because when he goes into verse 8, the yellow part at the bottom of the left, when he goes into verse 8, he's making a direct accusation at the hostile Jews. Now, of course, if you're going to make an accusation like that, you have to back it up with evidence. Unless, of course, you're on social media, then people say all kinds of things without evidence. But anyway, Jesus does back up the accusation that he makes toward the Pharisees with a scriptural application. And he said to them, you ignore the command of God very well to establish your tradition. Since Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and the one bad mouthing father and mother, let him come to the end in death. But you say, if a man tells his father or mother, this is Corban, a gift to God, what from me would have benefited you, you don't permit him to accomplish anything for father or mother. So you're invalidating the word of God with your tradition, which you hand along, and many other negative things that you accomplish. As you can see, this is an extreme and essentially cruel practice called Corban in English, sometimes spelled Korban when it's transliterated. Now, in Corban, vows could be made to withdraw money or property from ordinary use to dedicate it to sacred purposes. For example, the work of the temple. But the owner still retained the title of possession. But if anybody wanted anything from it, he could use the excuse, oh, I'm sorry, I dedicated the money. The word is Corban, to get himself free of responsibility. And it was, of course, as we say, a cop-out, because the possessions were safe and secure for as long as the owner wished. But the practice was horrendous because if his parents were needy, and honoring the parents would be to take care of the parents, he could say, I'd like to help you, mom and dad, but I've donated all my money to the temple. I'd like to help you, but the rabbis won't let me touch it. It's out of my hands. So this is a perfect example of where a minute regulation that was supposed to help people be generous towards God's service or God's temple suddenly ends up actually violating one of the Ten Commandments. As you see here, honor thy father and mother. Jesus says in another place that, and this is the first commandment with a promise, that your days may be long upon the life of the earth. So how ironic this is that the word for gift is coming from the Hebrew verb for bringing near, as in bringing near to God. And yet you're cutting off the ones that God said to love. And although the writing style seems somewhat dated 70 years later, I really like the way F.C. Grant put it. Quote, what lay back of it was the same rigorous, heartless, inhumanly logical casuistry that we find in many a school of professional religionists in other ages and in other religions. Now, casuistry means to drill down to specific cases, and it often leads to violating an overarching and sometimes more important principle. And as you see outlined in red over on the left, in this case, it's the poster child image of sacrificing God's command to honor parents for a temple fundraising gimmick. And the tragedy goes further. the actual resources didn't have to be used for God's service in order for them to be forbidden for human use, just declared. So imagine if you had declared your garden to be korban, to be a gift for God's use, and the priest didn't need your garden. Instead of taking vegetables over to your aging mom and dad, you had to let them rot in the garden because they weren't for human consumption. They were for God's service. Well, even when said in good faith, this law contravenes the divine law because the duty to the parent should take precedent over an obligation to make offerings. And you can even increase the tragic nature beyond what I've said, because once this declaration was uttered, the person was absolutely forbidden by the system to use any of the dedicated resources to help others. Jesus chose this as a dramatic example of what happens when our religion is so heavenly minded that it's of no earthly good. By claiming to worship God, symbolically using the vertical, they were ignoring human needs, symbolically ignoring the horizontal. So what happened was that they had a distorted religion. So even just placing the case law of Corban side by side with the commandment to honor and care for one's parents, the position of the Pharisees and the scribes is absolutely illogical. So Jesus calls them out on it. In fact, the participle that I translated as invalidating in verse 13, invalidating the word of God, means to deprive a thing of its very strength. So these legal experts who were trying to tell people in minutiae of how to uphold the law, these experts were really undermining the very thing that they were accusing Jesus of violating. So then Jesus explains with a more general application. In fact, the wording in verse 14 absolutely suggests that he had unloaded this first bit where he quoted Isaiah and called them hypocrites and said they were invalidating and undermining the very word of God, that this was probably unloaded on the Pharisees and the scribes as a group, and not so much speaking it out loud to the crowd. But now he says the horrible thing out loud in verse 14 because now he's opening up his teaching to the crowd. It says, he called to the crowd and he said to them, hear me, all of you, and comprehend. There is nothing outside a human being that penetrating him has the power to make him profane. Rather, that which comes out is the making of a person profane. In other words, what comes out of a man is what contaminates him. So I love the verb that I translated as penetrating because it has the prefix for into and the verb for traveling, as in traveling into. And in this section, Jesus is using a form of parallelism that's known as antithetical parallelism, because you've placed opposites against each other in order to illustrate a point. And this antithetical parallelism was used by the rabbis, as well as the authors of Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. In fact, the Hebrew word from which we get Proverbs, mashal, that Hebrew word means to compare. And sometimes in the Old Testament, when we're talking about a parable, you use the word mashal because the parable is a comparison. It's putting something side by side. And that's why the disciples are later in the chapter going to ask Jesus to explain the parable. And those of us who always think of parables as a story are going to say, well, wait, what parable? He hasn't told a parable in this chapter. Well, yeah, he has, because a comparison is basically a parable. Now, there are those that takes this idea that nothing that goes into a man contaminates him, but it's only what comes from his inner self out that contaminates him, as meaning that Jesus had eliminated all of the Levitical rules, all the dietary rules, and all of the ritual purity rules for the Christian right here in this passage. But if he did, then I have to wonder, why did Peter have to have that vision of the clean and the unclean foods coming down from heaven on that rooftop in Joppa if Jesus had already taught him that clearly? Now, certainly, if we extrapolate from what Jesus is saying here, we get to the point where keeping kosher is no longer relevant. But right now, the emphasis is on the Levitical laws that Jews had allowed to take precedence over or invalidate laws that we knew came specifically from God. Now, I know that it's not the same thing. And an old Southern Baptist scholar suggested that the phrase that's coming up in verse 19, making all foods clean, is a result of Peter reminiscing to Mark long after the vision in Joppa, as if what Peter is saying is, now I get it. Now I see what my Lord was getting at way back in the day when he said, it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, it's what goes out of him. Now I get it. But clearly, they didn't understand at the time. Now, most manuscripts do not have verse 16. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. That doesn't actually appear in most manuscripts, and it doesn't hurt anything. So I believe I'll be showing it on the next slide, because Jesus often did say that phrase. So I don't see a problem with having it here, and it doesn't disrupt anything, except that we usually expect him to have a parable or a saying, a pronouncement, a command, some kind of miracle right after he says that. And nothing happens here except that he goes into a house. So let's pay attention to what's really important, starting in verse 17. And when he went into a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him about the parable. So he said to them, then are you also senseless? Don't you get it? That anything which penetrates a person from the outside isn't able to make one profane? Because it doesn't penetrate the heart, the will, the decision-making organ, but it penetrates the stomach and it exits into the latrine. And then we have the statement, making all foods clean, which we should probably take as Jesus said this to make all foods clean. But as I said before, if he had made it clear that all foods were clean right then, it sure didn't come through to Peter until he had to have that vision of that sheet with the unclean and the clean foods coming down and God saying, take, eat. Now, we're going to pause here before we go on to Jesus's list of specific examples. But the fact that the text speaks of a house rather than the house probably suggests that the venue here was not Capernaum and the house of Peter, as some have suggested. Now, the photograph in the bottom right-hand corner is an archaeological site in the biblical layer of Capernaum that is said to be the house of Peter. And the Catholics are so convinced that this is the house of Peter that they built a church building on top of it. And you see that pillar in the middle of the picture? That's one of the supporting pillars holding up this church, which is this church that's built over the top of what's supposed to be Peter's house. But one would think if Jesus went into Peter's house in verse 17, that Mark would have specified it, or at least given it the definitive article, the house, as the house in which they usually stayed. Even if it was Peter's in-laws' house, it might be clarified as it is in another gospel in another situation. After all, Mark's primary source is supposed to be Peter. You would think if it was Peter's house, Peter would have said something about our house. We've already discussed parable as being comparison and the phrase about making all foods clean. But what about this private conference with the disciples? It isn't as detailed as Matthew 15:12, where it seems clear that the disciples recognized the Pharisees were uncomfortable with what Jesus said, and that the Pharisees and the scribes had been offended by Jesus's parable. And so it seems that Jesus's response about their not understanding sounds a lot like Jesus perceived them as becoming too sympathetic toward the Pharisees' camp. It's almost as if Jesus is saying to them, have you lost your mind too? But theologically, this is a seminal moment. Werner Kelber says, quote, the confidential piece of information concerns the fact that all ritual uncleanliness is replaced by inward purity. And a new morality has taken the place of ceremonial cleanliness. So the tradition is not merely liberalized, but it's overruled. And the legal barrier which prevented Gentiles from full participation in the kingdom has now been removed. And if, end quote. And if you don't believe it, stick around and hear about the Syrophoenician woman in the last part of the chapter. But as I noted, this phrase that I put in parentheses was probably added by Mark because the disciples didn't understand the full significance at the time. Nevertheless, it's true. And before we move to the list of specifics, I want to share something as an illustration of the principle that Jesus is elucidating here. But I want to do a parable, a modern parable, in the sense that it comes from a secular perspective, but I believe it introduces a biblical point that Jesus was just making. I read it in a book on influencing people that a friend of mine in my gaming club gave to me. The book is The Power Principle, Influence with Honor by Dr. Blaine Lee. Now, it seems that during the Vietnam conflict, Dr. Lee worked with the United States Air Force Academy in preparing pilots for Vietnam. And part of the training course was going through a survival training where they would be captured and placed in a simulated prisoner of war camp that was built based on aerial photography of the actual camps in Nam. And Lee said that in the course of just 3 weeks in this pseudo concentration camp, they became fatigued physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Part of his job was to watch and see if they were likely to crack. Then at the end of training, they would open up the gates and liberate the camp. And so surviving the camp ended up making them so confident that they could survive the real thing too. Now, 3 weeks of reduced food intake, of being awakened every time you even thought you were going to get some sleep, and the like, is not a trivial thing to go through. So to celebrate their success, the course faculty hosted the cadets to a sumptuous banquet. And as they were eating and congratulating each other and bragging about what they would do when they got to Vietnam, then Lee brought in a surprise guest speaker. The speaker was an Air Force Academy alumnus who had served in Nam and been shot down and captured by the Viet Cong. So immediately, these recent grads of the survival training exercise started peppering him with questions. But those questions were almost as clueless as our disciples in the text. One cadet wanted to know the best combat survival knife to take. And the veteran answered, "It's not about knives." He told them that he had been through the same training that they had been through. And from there, he went to pilot school, and then he went to more survival training in the jungles of the Philippines. He told them that during pilot training, he had been issued a vest that sounded almost like Batman's utility belt because it contained a pistol, ammunition, antibiotic tablets, and any survival gear that the service thought could help him survive on the ground. So when his plane was hit by enemy fire and he knew the plane was going down, subconsciously he touched the vest, so reassured that the vest and all that equipment was going to be there. It gave him reassurance and confidence. But when the plane crashed, he was injured on impact and he was lying helpless for a time enough to be captured by the Viet Cong. And do you know what the first thing they stripped off his body was? You guessed it, it was that wonderful vest of many things. So now the cadets started listening carefully to this guy. And one of the cadets asked, "So without any gear, what did you use to break free?" And they clearly thought maybe his secret was going to be some high-tech weapon, or maybe that he MacGyvered, he jury-rigged some kind of weapon there on the spot. But his answer was almost as shocking as Jesus's parable in our text. He said, quote, "I survived all right, but it wasn't because of what I had on me. It was what I had in me that made the difference." Now, this is what Jesus was getting at. One can dress the part. One can have all the tools. One can have the education. But if one doesn't have the will, it doesn't make a difference. So when I went to graduate school, I was disappointed that I was passed over for a prestigious fellowship. And I was assigned to 2 relatively minor fellowships. One of them was in religious drama, and one of them in Old Testament Hebrew. But they weren't with the star professors. But as the drama fellow, I ended up writing a play that was produced there and at more than one church. And while I was fellow for this young professor, I ended up being asked to teach for a week as the guest professor of a more established Hebrew professor. And he ended up editing the Holman Dictionary of the Bible and wrote the Word Biblical Commentary on Joshua. And the young professor who hadn't built his reputation yet, that I worked for directly, ended up as one of the editors on the Mercer Dictionary of the Bible. So even though I was disappointed that I didn't get the prestigious fellowship, I worked hard at school and in my minor fellowships. And just before my final year, the grad student with the more prestigious fellowship dropped out. And by that time, it was too late for me to change fellowships. But when the articles needed to be written for the Holman Bible Dictionary and the Mercer Dictionary of the Bible, who do you think was invited to contribute? Mr. Prestige or Little Johnny? Well, obviously, I wouldn't be telling the story if it wasn't Little Johnny. It was the guy who had the inner drive to do everything he could possibly do to get the education God had provided him. No prestige, but God's opportunity. And I share that because one's heart, one's will can do good things or bad things. Because the Pharisees were concentrated on what was corrupting and what was contaminating. And Jesus is going to give us a list of those tainted, profane things that come, but they come when one's will, one's inner decision-making organ, process, reality is set on the wrong thing. For from within, there comes out of the will of a person the evil plans, immoral sex, theft, adultery, murder, coveting, wickedness, deception, wantonness, evil eyes, defamation, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come out from within, and they make a person profane. Now, if you look closely on the right side of the screen, you'll notice that all of the sins that are listed are inside the bookends of verse 21 and verse 23. The idea of coming from within, the idea of coming out of a person instead of going in is dominant. And then as for the sin list itself, there's some overlap among these sinful actions that are derived from inner attitudes. For example, the word for fornication originally meant having sex with a prostitute, but it came to be applied to any sexual immorality except for adultery, because adultery was a specific violation of your marital commitment. Now, stealing or theft is a bad thing on its own, but coveting is usually the root when one wants something that's not one's own. And murder has its own finality, but it ultimately originates in a pride that says, my life is worth more than someone else's. And both wickedness and wantonness seem to be about committing harmful deeds, but it seems like wickedness gets directed at other people, while wantonness is primarily letting yourself go into harmful directions. Now, of course, one can do wicked things and hide one's sin, at least for a time. The one who is wanton is open and shameless about their self-destructive behavior. And we're not quite through yet, because similar to the relationship between wickedness and wantonness is the relationship between deception and defamation. Deception or deceit has that root idea of luring or enticing someone into doing something that hurts them. While defamation, that's often translated as blasphemy, is using speech that's directed at another to slander or defame them. So it's really blasphemy if it's directed toward God, and defamation or slander if it's directed toward another human being. Now, the only pair that doesn't really quite seem connected to me is evil eyes and foolishness. Evil eyes could mean magical curses in the ancient world, but I like Cranfield's explanation that they are the greedy persons, as in Proverbs 23:6, the stingy ones. Or Gould's idea that it's a Hebrew expression for envy. But also with Taylor, I've got to say, it still might mean magical curses. Nevertheless, foolishness is literally the unthinking person, the person who just doesn't think about what they're doing. Or as Bengel said, foolishness is placed last because it renders the rest more incurable. Yet all of these are coming from what we decide from the inside. So he arose, went out into the region of Tyre and Sidon in some manuscripts, and he entered into a house that didn't have anyone knowing him, but he could not escape notice. Now, if you don't think what Jesus said about the inside contaminating the person when it comes out, consider the fact that Jesus leaves Galilee. Let's assume he was in Capernaum. He leaves Galilee and he goes to Tyre. Tyre is a non-Jewish port in what is now Lebanon. In the background of that photo, you can see the modern city today. In the foreground, what you see are the submerged ruins of the early port of Jesus' day. The animated arrow shows you the relationship of Tyre to Capernaum. It's not the way that you expected Jesus to go after this encounter. Werner Kelber sees this retreat from the hostility of the crowd and the authorities as a significant expansion of Jesus's mission of introducing the kingdom of God. So the area of the lake is left for a trip to the northernmost Gentile point. Of course, in Tyre, we're not at the northernmost Gentile point because when Jesus retreats from here, whoa, what happened? When Jesus retreats from here, he's going to go around. But first, he's going to go up to Sidon, and then he's going to go down to the Decapolis. But we'll get there in a later slide. I just remembered. So since this is the farthest north to this point that the kingdom teaching has been, as you might expect, the new space is purged first by an exorcism in verses 24 to 30, and second by a healing in verses 32 to 37. So Jesus retreats, and he needs some personal workspace and living space. But Mark's typical vocabulary tells us that was not going to happen because it says immediately. But immediately, a woman whose daughter had a tainted spirit heard concerning him and came falling in front of his feet. But the woman was Hellenic, Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth. And she begged him in order that he would throw out the demon from her daughter. And he said to her, "First, let the children be fed, for it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the puppies." Now, this is a very difficult passage for us to interpret because it sounds like Jesus is a racist. It sounds like he was unwilling to help her. I mean, he indirectly called the woman a dog. The Jews called Gentiles dogs as an epithet, but at least Jesus uses a diminutive here so that this would be a little dog. Think puppy or cute dog or a pet. But think about it. This woman was treated as less than she should have been by the rabbis and all the good Jews on three counts. Number one, her gender. Number two, her nationality as Greek. And number three, her identification with a pagan society. Syrophoenicia is where Baal worship came from. And now they've got all these Greco-Roman gods intertwining with their ancient heritage from long ago. And of course, when Jesus says, first the children, and then the dogs, the puppies, Jesus seems to be echoing the mission that he'll crystallize in the book of Acts when he says, "You'll represent me from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria and to the furthest reaches of the world." Now, he doesn't say that he won't help her. He says he will help her after the children, another word used for the Jews. And this even somewhat applies to the church today. Jesus said, feed the children, our target group. Feed the target group first, and then you'll be able to minister to others with the crumbs that you spill. And that's where we see the woman's understanding of Jesus' jest actually come through. And she answered and said to him, "Lord, even the puppies under the table eat from the crumbs of the children." Now, some of us who might be in her shoes might take offense rather than interacting authentically with Jesus, joking and in repartee like she did. But I think she demonstrates faith in three ways. First, she recognizes that she's dependent on grace. She's asking for something she doesn't deserve. So she takes no offense that he might have insulted her with the puppy comment. She takes no offense, and she just waits to see what he's going to do. Second, she trusts in God's provision. When she says, even the puppies get to eat the crumbs that the children leave, she's saying she trusts God's provision that even if it only proves to be crumbs, she's going to be grateful for it. And then finally, when Jesus says, go home, the demon's gone, she believes Jesus's words and she acts upon that. Now, the former pastor of Crescent Hill Baptist Church in Louisville, where I attended whenever I wasn't interim pastoring or supply preaching or holding Bible conferences, was John Claypool before I was there. Now, he speaks well of this idea of crumbs in a book called Stages, The Art of Living the Expected. And he says, quote, real maturity is achieved when the bittersweet quality of all existence is accepted rather than resented. All sunshine makes a desert, states an old Arab proverb. Wise is the person who comes to realize this fact and begins to acknowledge hardship as the elder brother of good, end quote. So, like the mature person that Claypool describes, this woman gratefully accepts whatever God gives her. But even when Jesus tells her that her request is answered, notice he doesn't give her anything visual, anything physical to depend on. In verse 29, he just tells her the demon's gone. And she doesn't just believe, as some people treat faith, she also acted upon it. And she doesn't question, she just leaves the presence of the Lord, that visual and physical assurance of his reality, and she returns home, and the promise is secure. The deed is done. Now, someone has said that hope means learning that every exit is an entrance, and maybe that's what this woman found. Now, I gave you my three aspects of faith. Let me give you Ralph Martin's. First, he says she was altruistic because it wasn't her needs she was bringing to Jesus, it was her daughter's needs. And secondly, she was persistent because she refused to be rebuffed by Jesus's strangely cool response. And then C, she was inventive as she began to authentically interact with Jesus in a form of repartee. So here, literally, what has happened is the mission has gone to the Jews and the Jews have rejected it. And now Jesus has gone to Tyre. And here at Tyre, he ministers to a Greek. So the mission has gone to the Jews first and then to the Greeks. Now the mission continues in verse 31 with a very strange itinerary. As I said, they were in Tyre and they went up to Sidon. That's also still in Syrophoenicia, and it's also Gentile territory, and they're still expanding the kingdom. But then they avoid all the populous areas of Galilee and go directly to the Decapolis, the 10 city-states that are there. Interestingly, we know that Jesus already has an advanced man in the Decapolis, the erstwhile demoniac from earlier in the gospel. So even if he wouldn't have generated crowds on his own, we know he would have, there may be a residual effect of having somebody who's already been testifying all over the Decapolis of what Jesus has done for him. So arriving in that region, they bring a person who can't hear and has a problem speaking. That really isn't surprising as many who aren't able to hear from early on have difficult in being verbally intelligible. And we've heard of laying hands on before, but Jesus's physical actions in this healing are very interesting because we're not used to a healing service where someone sticks his fingers in a person's ears and then spits and touches the other person's mouth. But that's what Jesus did. But we have to remember that in some parts of the world, even today, saliva is considered a blessing. Imagine grandma spitting on her grandchildren, like in some old world customs, and you get the picture. But even though Jesus wasn't doing anything excessively gross, I noticed that he didn't put on a show in front of the crowd. He brought the man to a place of relative privacy, at least away from the crowd. And I would hope that that would give you and I a hint that some ministry needs to respect privacy. Now, we don't know what Jesus's groan is exactly. He groans before he says, Ephphatha, open up. We don't know what Jesus's groan is. It could be empathy toward the man. It could be an oral expression of disgust at the disease. Or maybe it was just to indicate that he was engaging in spiritual battle in this healing. Maybe to illustrate a fulfillment of, quote, the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped, end quote, in Isaiah 35:5. But regardless, the man is healed, and Jesus, tells them, don't tell anybody. He tries to keep everything quiet, but they ignore his command. Why? Because the inconceivable power of God simply cannot be kept hidden. Now, I'm going to close here and upload Mark 8 next week.